Hi, my name is Mike Sloan, and I'm a medieval combat enthusiast. I've been a student of medieval combat for as long as I can remember, and for the past 5 years I've actually been strapping on medieval armor and doing medieval combat recreation in the Society of Creative Anachronism. I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk to you about something that I have spent a great deal of time with, but you may not encounter on an everyday basis. I'd like to introduce to you the sword. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the history of the sword, how we make them, how we used them, and why we quit using them, and hopefully give you a better understanding about how important this tool was into the creation of the world that you see around you today. The sword has a very important place in our history, and it's very unique in the fact that it was one of the very first things that we ever made to kill other human beings. People would argue that the spear and the bow and arrow had been killing humans long before the sword was ever created, and they're absolutely correct. But the bow and arrow and the spear were not originally designed for that. Their original purpose was for hunting. We adapted them to kill human beings, but that wasn't what they were originally designed for. That's not the case with the sword. You don't hunt game with a sword. You don't use a sword as a utility tool. You don't chop a tree down with a sword. Swords have one purpose and have only ever had one purpose, and that was killing people. The sword is a relatively new invention. It wasn't created until about 1700 BC, which we consider the Bronze Age. The reason it took us that long to be able to create a sword in the first place was because it took us that long to find a metal that could be used in sword creation. Swords have to have a certain length, and they have to have a certain density to be able to take the hits and be usable in combat. A longer sword can give you an advantage in combat. So it took us finding bronze to be able to develop that capability. According to Neil Burridge over at BronzeAgeSwords.com, the way that we would create those early bronze swords were to take copper and tin and make an alloy out of it, and superheat it, turn it into a liquid, and then pour it vertically into a clay mold that was the shape of the sword that you wanted. And then you'd separate the clay mold. Bronze wasn't ideal, but it was the best thing we had, up until about the 12th to the 7th centuries BC. And it was used prolifically throughout that time frame. They started to show up around Greece, and then they went all the way up into northern Europe, into Norway and Sweden and Denmark area, all the way over to China, all the way into India, all the way down into Egypt, and further south into South Africa. But then we discovered something new. We discovered iron. The Iron Age came to humanity, and we had a new metal, and we couldn't wait to kill each other with it. The iron swords at first weren't that much better than the bronze ones, but we made a lot of them. And when it was all said and done, by the 5th century BC, Iron Age swords had replaced Bronze Age swords across the board. We also discovered that we could mix carbon in with the iron. And once we did that, we created steel. And steel was the big game changer. Steel gave swords everything that a sword needed to be successful. Steel allowed the swords to be flexible so that they wouldn't break on impact, but also be rigid enough to hold a sharp edge and not go dull. The way that we created the steel swords was different than the Bronze Age ones. Instead of drop forging them, we would actually superheat the metal and then hammer it into shape that we wanted. By hammering it, we would actually work harden the metal. People have seen, I'm sure, movies such as Gladiator with Russell Crowe, or you've watched Spartacus on TV perhaps. This right here is a gladius. That was pretty much the standard style of sword that would have been used back during that period of time. They were very, very effective, and people conquered the world with it. Nations rose and fell. Religions came and went, and wealth changed hands, all on the sword. As we learned more and more and more about swords and the creation and craft of swords, we learned that we could change the alloys of the swords. We learned that we could quench them with oil and water to be able to build new flexibility and new tempers into the blades. We also learned that we could change the shapes of the blades, and we started developing blades with all kinds of different purposes. You've probably seen the movie Braveheart with Mel Gibson with those big, long, two-handed swords that were designed simply for chopping people up. You've seen The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, who had katanas who were designed for very different reasons. You've seen the movies like the King Arthur tales that had your standard longswords. And you've probably seen movies like The Three Musketeers where they had rapiers. The swords developed to defeat the armors of the time. So as armors changed, the sword shapes and designs and everything changed as well. But then we invented something totally new. We invented the firearm. And once the firearm was created, swords were basically obsolete at that point. We still issued swords to officers as late as World War I, but they could never match the effectiveness of a rifle or a pistol. So the swords left the battlefields, but they never left our hearts. The swords are still, to this day, swords are still considered a status symbol. Swords are still considered art. Swords are still considered collector's items. They're coveted parts of our culture. And the mastery of the sword is still something that people do all over the world. So even though we may not be still killing each other with swords, they're still a part of our culture. The sword really did help create everything that you see around you by shaping the nations of our ancestors. And for me personally, mastery of the sword is a lifelong ambition of mine. So as far as I'm concerned, I'll have a sword in my hands until the day I die. Thank you for your time. Have a nice night.